I've talked on this channel before about how I really love Bildungsromans, which I take to be stories that are about the entirety of a character's life. You meet them when they're really young, and a story ends when they are at a point of acceptance or stability, and they're more or less done changing. There are lots of books like this: Jane Eyre, The Goldfinch, Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. Yeah, it's a fairly popular method of telling the story. Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson is a very interesting take on this kind of story, this genre of books, in that it is telling the story of this man, Robert Grenier, in the 1800s in the Pacific Northwest. He's a logger. He works on these huge projects like bridges and clearing out forests and laying down railroad tracks. His story is told in a non-linear fashion. And so in that way, this book stands in contrast to the books that I just described, like The Goldfinch. There is a little bit of non-linearity in the fact that the character or the narrator is looking back at their life and telling the story themselves. Train Dreams, Robert Grenier's life is relayed to us via the third person, and it's fragmented. It's not told in order, and it's not that Grenier is looking back and reminiscing on his life, but it is still the story of his life. And I think that this novella I find really fascinating, particularly for its form. I feel like I'm starting to develop a sort of pet project for myself where I am really interested in these books where it is concerned primarily with telling the story of one character and telling their life story and getting the reader intimately familiar with that character. In terms of that, Train Dreams, I think, is not necessarily trying to create that sense of intimacy or interiority for Robert Grenier. Because of the third person and also just the shortness of the book, you don't get that closeness that you get with a book like Jane Eyre or Frankenstein or Robin Hobb's Fitz books. Though speaking of Robin Hobb, I will say that this novella reminds me very heavily of Fool's Errand, which is one of my favorite books in the entire 16-book series of The Realm of the Elderlings. But yeah, I really enjoyed this novella, and I recommend it, if only because it is so short. You could read it in an afternoon in one sitting. It's not a heavy lift. One of the interesting things about Train Dreams is that it was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2012, which is famously the year where nothing won. Not only was it deemed unworthy to win the prize, but it was deemed unworthy in a year where nothing else won either, which I don't know as an author if I would feel better or worse if that were my book. I would feel worse. To talk a little more specifically about the plot and themes of Train Dreams, it is very much concerned, I think, with the history of that time period. Death comes up over and over, and the various ways that one could die in that time period in the Pacific Northwest when you were in these situations where you were logging and doing like very hard manual labor. There were 1,001 ways to die, and I feel like in the beginning of this novella, there was a character dying every few pages or every few paragraphs. Part of the world that Johnson creates here is a world where it is beautiful because of the nature of the Pacific Northwest. It's gorgeous. And the descriptions, I think, reflect that. But there is also a respect for and I don't want to say fear, but just a respect for the horrible realities that nature can bring about and the ironies that nature imposes on us as humans, if that makes sense. It really made me think of just the pure amount of death that went into settling the West. Manual laborers who died because of XYZ accident, but also I think this book has something to say about the racial tensions of that time where Chinese laborers were treated horribly. The book quite literally opens on the scene of a Chinese laborer who this mob is trying to execute. It is just a very dark book in that regard. When I started this book, it definitely felt like the kind of story that I wasn't sure if I was going to particularly enjoy it. As the story went on, I really just fell in love with Johnson's writing, and it's not a particularly flowery form of writing. I feel like it's very intensely American and Hemingway-esque in its sort of form and prose. Actually quite difficult to pull off that kind of simple, no-nonsense prose that is somehow still beautiful and direct in communicating exactly what it wants to communicate. Given the plot and how strange and coincidental it is at times and how much it relies on just acts of nature, I think that if the prose had been flowery or overdone, it would have felt insincere. But as it is, the plainness of the prose really adds to just the matter-of-factness. Later on in this book, there are some supernatural elements that you could read as either being truly supernatural or perhaps the hallucinations of Robert Grenier. I do want to watch the movie, but I don't have Netflix, and I'm going to be visiting my parents soon, so I'm going to watch the movie. I've heard the movie plays it really safe, and I've also seen things that say that the movie changes things from the books. Broken record I am talking about movies changing things from books, but I really love Joel Edgerton. He's a great actor. I liked him a lot in Loving when that came out. When was that? 2017? He plays a similar character in that movie where he's like a blue-collar manual laborer, hard living, but also a good living. Overall, I feel like this novella just sort of harkened back to a time period in America that I think a lot of people tend to valorize, glamorize, romanticize. I think that made me hesitant to love this book. Fight Club syndrome, where it's like Fight Club is satire of toxic masculinity, but it also became a symbol of toxic masculinity. That doesn't stop me from appreciating the book for what it is, and I might be projecting my own beliefs onto the book and reading what I want to read. So be curious to hear what everyone else thinks about this book if you've read it. Again, super short, so give it a shot if you want. Love the similarities to Robin Hobb's Fool's Errand because I love that book. Yeah. If I'm a little out of it, I apologize. I'm pretty tired, but Vlogmas is going well and I don't want to stop now. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in tomorrow's video.